Right. Looks like we have just about everybody, and I believe we are live based on the note I see on the screen.
We are live on the YouTube page. It'll just take Emily one more minute to get us live on the public meeting page, and then we'll be good to go.
Okay.
All right, we are now live everywhere.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this will commence the first meeting for the special committee to review the standards of accreditation. I'd like to thank my fellow committee members for joining me on this endeavor, and definitely welcome the other board members and DOE staff to joining the discussion. I prepared a action plan document that I was going to propose that we use to guide our planning, to guide our discussion and our action planning moving forward. I apologize now. I work at the shipyard. We over-engineer everything. And so I'm very flexible and open to any other approach, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But if I'm able to share screen now, what I would like to do is first just go over, I guess you could say, today's agenda. It's built into part of the action planning, but I'll ask if I can get a thumbs up that people can see my document. Thank you, Dr. Doran. So under initial key tasks or our agenda today, I'd like to just discuss our action plan approach. I'm going to very briefly go through this document just to kind of baseline us in some structure of thought. And whether it's this document or some other modified version of it, we end up starting at the very beginning, basically gaining consensus from the committee on the scope of work. We had a lot of discussion yesterday at the board meeting about the intent of this work and the scope. And so I just want to reaffirm the committee's understanding, and that ultimately becomes our objective that begins to outline this document. So we'll do that. I'd like to have a discussion about identifying any other advisors to the committee, get some recommendations, whether that's organizations, whether that's professionals themselves. I'd like to just kind of open that up for discussion. I'd like to spend some time determining what additional data presentations we'd like to request of the DOE. A couple of items, one listed there relative to the matrix-based system. That's something that I had some interest myself in digging a little deeper. But again, as a committee, I'd like us to agree on what specific data points we would like to hear from the board so we can begin to kind of plan out what that timeline could look like. And then I'd like to wrap up just with some discussion around like agreeing around a high level timeline and what our meeting cadence will be. I do plan on extending this meeting to 2:15. It was supposed to be an hour meeting. I will be wrapping up at 2:15 because I do have a hard stop then. But if time permits, then we will go ahead and work on, and my recommendation would be to go ahead and work on starting to discuss some of the inputs to the working plan, the action plan that we're going to go through above, based on some of the discussions yesterday and our thoughts today. So if that sounds like an okay approach for this meeting, I'll look for some nods from my teammates. Okay, great. All right, so basically what this action plan approach does is it helps us really first baseline and what the objective is. And part of our efforts will be to determine what does end state look like. Ultimately, said differently, as a committee, what will finished look like for us? And that might be a little hard to identify right now. That's why it's TBD. I typically like to address the end state statement after we've had at least one solid good meeting of discussion on filling out the meat of some of the things you'll see below. But then under the mission analysis, which is really just kind of breaking down what we know, what we think, what we feel, and key things we must protect or be aware of. This approach, in my experience in the past, has really helped organize the team's thoughts around uh, a consistent path plan forward. So I, I had some initial notes myself coming into this. I captured a lot of notes yesterday in the board meeting, so I went ahead and took the liberty of putting some of those things in some of these categories just to give the committee some context. Where I put them may not be where they belong, and that'll be part of our discussion. And I also left some open-ended statements in some categories just to ensure that um, that our frame of thought kind of prompts us in the right direction. You'll see some more of that as we scroll down. So we want to start with what we absolutely know, and we know a lot when it comes to the standards of accreditation. If we just look at the presentation that we got yesterday, there's a lot of facts in that, maybe too many facts, and to the point of simplicity. But really, we want to kind of bottom line up front the key things that we know about the current system, and maybe even its history, that may have relevance to our discussions moving forward. Obviously, some assumptions that we might make. I identified one there that we could assume. In one case, we might know that the accreditation might be waived this year, but we don't know about next year. It's an assumption. So I'm sure there's other assumptions we'll make. And then, considerations. This is where I identified a lot of the comments from the board as far as questions to flesh out, things to consider. And then we go into limitations, and there's two types of limitations. This is always an important part of the discussion, because a lot of times teams get too far down the road and they realize that they didn't consider a guideline or a restriction or some sort of factor that would have changed the direction of the team's thoughts. So we get those out up front, maybe not all collectively, but we try to get a good stab at it. So constraints are things that we must do and include in our plan, like absolutes, and then the restraints are things that we must avoid doing, right? Risks, we probably interpret that a little bit differently in the engineering world, but ultimately for this, an example of risks for us would be unintended outcomes. Priorities, we're certainly going to want to prioritize. To me, the priority sections ties very closely to the end state, because it really should, really, if it's what matters in this work, then it should be the outcome of this work. And then so then that's really just kind of baselining the team in what we know and what we think, and what we feel. Then we move into actions, and we actually, they're kind of obviously in tandem. We're actually taking an action right now by confirming this approach, but particularly the meat of this will be under additional key tasks, where we begin to identify other actions that we want to take or consider or evaluate as part of this committee. A lot of times those additional key tasks will also help define the timeline once we really get a feel for how much we got to go after. So And then obviously the goal is to get to some sort of recommendations if it warrants any, and then to chart the way ahead. How do you close the gap between the recommendations and what actually gets put in place? So really basic. It's not anything designed by NASA. But for me, and some of the teams I've been on and led, it really helps organize and makes the meetings in my mind more effective. So I'll pause there to open up the floor to anyone to really provide any suggestions, particularly about the format, not necessarily getting into the words yet that's in it, as far as reviewing the standards of accreditation, but open to some discussions about taking this approach.
So Dr. Paxton, I'm sorry. Francisco, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Dr. Wilson.
I was just going to say the outline or having the structure is really very helpful, and understanding that we may move some things around, but the structure is, I think, really helpful. I think I know I will need to be probably reminded or ensure that I am using the terminology in the same way that you are, with some of the things. And so that may be something that, to kind of make sure we all remain on the same page, that we're all defining things in the same way.
Yeah.
And the way you've explained them at the outset is helpful, but we may have to, I know for me, I may need you to bring me back. Wait, Wilson, that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, no, that's good. And part of this discussion too is if we do agree to go with this approach, and we don't necessarily have to get into those details now, but I'm not tied to these words.
Understood.
So
Yeah.
we'll want to make it comfortable for all of us.
That's understood. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you for this. I really appreciate the format, and it helps organize us in a way, because, listening to the presentation yesterday and how much is in standards of accreditation, we certainly could go into a lot of different places. So this really helps guide us. The only question I had, and I don't know if it's getting too much into the conversation, so you could pause me if it is, the end state and the recommendations and connecting to the objective, I would like to understand from maybe Dr. Lane or Holly Coy, I think she's on, if we were to make recommendations, and if there was an end state, is there a certain date and a time that would help to influence so that changes could be made that would have an impact on schools? What is that timeline? Often when we're thinking about any accreditation changes, there is a time and a place that needs to occur, and I'm not clear on when that would be, and that would help me to think about the objective and the end state. And again, Keisha, if that's getting too much into the work, I'll pause if you're still talking about the format. But for me, as I think about the format for this, that really helps me to think through a lot of the areas that you were talking about, each of these components.
Now I'll just take that real quick, Dr. Paxton, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
And maybe it's really a deferral to Emily, but Francisco, what you may want to know is how the regulatory process works, because the time from the time you make your decisions to implementation can be very lengthy. We were able to do the 2017 revision pretty quickly because it was a priority for Governor McAuliffe, so they expedited some of the review on the governor's side. But Emily, do you want to talk about some of that?
Sure, absolutely. So there are, and I won't go through the whole regulatory scheme today, but there are several steps with the regulatory process. First, and we will plan to bring this to the board at your July meeting, we are going to have to do a notice of intended regulatory action. And that's just really setting up the framework that the board is starting to think about changes to the regulations. You don't have to put in there what those changes are going to be necessarily, but we do need to start that process. From there, and that goes through the executive branch review process, which includes the Attorney General, the Department of Planning and Budget, as well as the Secretary and Governor's Office. From there, we'll go into a proposed stage and then final stage, each of those stages having public comment opportunities for folks to give feedback to the board, in addition to when you would have your regular feedback at board meetings. Typically, the regulatory process is an 18-month process from kind of start to finish. We do, when the proposed changes are where you make the bulk of your changes from proposed to final, it's really just kind of refinements and tweaks based on any public comment or any new information that the board may receive. As Dr. Lane mentioned, we did somewhat expedite our 2017 revisions because we worked with the governor's office along the way, and we can do that again this time. We had several briefings with them so that their review didn't take quite as long as a normal review process. We reviewed with them in advance to make sure they were comfortable with any changes. One other thing that I'll just note, we've had our own kind of staff internal working SOA committee for the last several months that is starting to look at potential tweaks and changes, really more on the technical aspect of it. But that's something that we could also bring to you all for consideration at a later date. Again, more technical changes than, major kind of policy shifts. But staff is certainly here to support that. So, my personal opinion, I think we're probably looking at potentially, not a short time frame of this being completed sometime in the fall, maybe sometime next year, this committee could, conclude their work to bring recommendations to the full board so that we then get them in a proposed stage format for regulatory action.
Could I ask a follow-on question? Sorry, James.
No, Jamal, please go.
So I have a question. You mentioned a first step being to kind of signal some change coming with some action in July. Yes. And then toward the end of your remarks, you talked about the technical adjustments that staff is looking at anyway. What we said yesterday in our work session was that we as a board are not entering this conversation with the intent of making changes, but rather to determine. So I wonder if by making a statement or beginning a process in July, does that signal that we already know what we're going to, that we're going to bring changes, or is that, are the technical changes something that also have to, I would want to be really careful that we're not signaling anything at this point. July is next week, so to speak, you know what I mean? And that just doesn't quite square.
Yeah, so to me, and we call it a NORA for short, a NORA just signals that you're starting to look and open up the regulations, and it's really, it's somewhat of a formality because we can't move into the other stages until we go through the NORA process. So even if the board decides later on, that you don't need any additional changes, you don't have to move forward with next steps if you determine that there isn't a need for it. And certainly, if the board feels like there are technical changes that the staff brings, but you don't have any policy changes, we could use that NORA as well. Ideally, we would have any changes this committee would do and any changes that the technical staff committee would look at and bring those together so it's one comprehensive action.
Great. Just didn't want to get over our skis on this thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Out of the gate.
And the only thing I was going to add, Dr. Paxton, to Emily's answer is, whereas there are ways that we could expedite this, as Emily said, to get to a year or 18-month timeline. And obviously working with the executive branch would help expedite that. But keep in mind, ultimately, the board has passed regulations before that have held an executive review for many years. So there's no guarantee that even if we do everything that we want to do, that your changes would happen fast. Obviously, the more we work hand in hand, that will happen. But just just being realistic, it could take time. And 18 months from now is in the middle of a gubernatorial transition, and so that could delay it for obvious reasons while the new administration comes on and gets up to speed, if we can't get it done by the time the Northam administration ends.
Any other questions or thoughts about or recommendations about this approach? Okay. Then you all will become engineers. All right. So So next, I want to spend some time just again baselining us and the scope of work, the objective. I took a stab very late last night at writing the paragraph. You see it in front of you, so I had to quickly read it to just make sure there was no typos. But this was my attempt of trying to really bottom line up front what we're trying to accomplish. And so I don't think we need to get into a wordsmith war, but I do think we have to have a solid understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, and I feel like we do. But so I'll read to you what I have here. You can read for yourself, but I think hearing it out loud just helps a little bit. So, and what I'll be looking for is feedback on how we can shore up our objectives. So the objective is to conduct a review of our newly implemented accreditation system to assess anticipated positive, negative, and unintended outcomes of performance indicators. Just a quick point there. Through some discussions I heard yesterday, and even some discussions I've had with Dan, and just kind of really understanding the history of this, I do think that I just want to delineate between positive, negative, and unintended. Some might think, well, what's the difference between negative and unintended? In my interpretation is that there might have been anticipated positive ones. There might have been anticipated negative ones. So we want to validate if that's true. And there might have been unintended outcomes. So just wanted to make that delineation or distinction. Consider data available since implementation, as well as current state affairs. Validate efficient progress towards original intended outcomes, and provide system change recommendations if warranted. So open the floor up for some feedback about making sure we've got a good baseline scope.
Could I ask a question? The statement validate efficient progress toward original intended outcomes. Help me understand what you mean by that.
So I struggled with that word. I had a sufficient there first, and because the system was newly implemented, and there might be a difference of opinion, I teetered on that word because I don't know if it had been in place long enough for us to be able to gauge what is sufficient. So we want to validate progress, but do we want, 1 degree of progress or 100 degrees of progress relative to the time? So, yeah.
And I think so hearing you explain it that way, I don't know that it would be a history lesson for us. I don't know if as the SOAs, as they currently exist, if the board contemplated benchmarks toward success, right? Or benchmarks toward outcomes by timeline, or I'm not certain about that. So it would be interesting to hear kind of a summary of what the thinking was at the time, or maybe we didn't even address it at all. But I understand the point that you're making. And then if there aren't such, if that conversation was not a concerted effort, then perhaps identifying what we would expect now, you know what I mean? Kind of putting some benchmarks in place. And I think somewhere you have in the document, I can't find it right now, but some intimation of that.
Yeah. I think that what I was trying to capture here is basically what I heard in what I understood the scope to be, and what I thought I heard validated yesterday in the working meeting was that we want to consider the time that has passed, recognizing it's not much. And so I was trying to capture, well, if we want to consider that time, then how would we consider it? How would we, so again, if there's a recommendation on how to better capture that or capture that differently, by all means, I'm ready to type.
I don't have a suggestion, but I will give it some thought.
Okay. I'm going to highlight that for now as a point to consider. Any other thoughts or is there a consensus on it as it's written, other than that highlighted part? Is there consensus that that's captured what our intent is?
I feel comfortable with it, with the caveat maybe that as we get further, just as we, there was some piece you were talking about maybe revisiting. So making sure that our objectives as we learn more still fits, or if we need to tweak it. But I think for me, structurally right now, it seems to capture where I think we want to start.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. All right. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about identifying who we think will be key contributors to our discussions over the next period of time, I'll say for now, relative to organizations or professionals. Dan, I know that when you and I spoke, you made reference to a couple of gentlemen who were part of a UVA organization or group, or so I don't know if you maybe wanted to share your thought there, if it's still a relevant thought, but any other suggestions that you guys may have.
You saw one of them today, Luke Miller. He, Curry School has done some work with us before, and Jim Wyckoff we've seen come before us. James, I don't know if you think they'd be good fits for where we, or Dan Player, where we want to go, but that's who I was referring to, Keisha, is UVA has been gracious at times to give us some support. From the outside, they've got a fairly broad view of the world and a lot of data from other places that might also help.
Okay.
James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I know that in talking with some of the folks at UVA, they tend to favor some of the more traditional type accountability measures. So I would pair that with somebody that is thinking more in the innovative space. And one of my recommendations would be to take a look at the team that we put together for the COVID-related task force and maybe pull some names from there. Lori McCullough at VASCD would be one recommendation. Alan Siebert from Salem. Rosa Atkins had really strong feelings on this, another superintendent. I would have a teacher rep, and so just a couple people like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna need you to go back to Lori McCullough. I am spelling challenged, and so could you mention those names?
I'll drop it to you in the chat.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and Keisha, I can also help with some of these names as we have a draft. I can go back and help edit as well. And Dr. Lane and I had even talked about potentially at a future meeting having the COVID accreditation task force come and present some of their recommendations to this group as well, which we can decide when it's best to have them come and potentially present to you.
Okay. I'm actually going to move them down here. But to your point earlier, Dr. Lane, you did recommend that there might actually be, so there's a COVID accreditation task force, but you recommended there might be some other COVID task force members as well that could be advisors, or were you specifically referring to the accreditation task force?
Yeah, I guess I would like to know how many advisors you were looking for. If you were looking for a very small number, then I would have a different take than if you wanted to have, a teacher rep, a principal rep, a superintendent rep, an association rep. So I would probably need clarity before, but I dropped a few groups that I would be really thoughtful about in the chat privately to you.
Okay. To that point, is there a thought amongst the committee as far as how many advisors? I didn't put very much thought into how many until James brought up that.
It might be useful to rather than putting a number on it, really understand what we need to know more about, and then identifying who the right people are. So I don't have specific names that I would suggest, but I don't know that, you know, wanting to make sure we have representation from A, B, C, and D makes sense before we really understand what more we need to know. And certainly we would want to have opportunities for input, but that's different, I think, from providing us advisement.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that thought. I think once we know more, we'll want to know more from folks. Maybe I was approaching this from a just continuing to get us, you know, solid in our understanding and what else we might want to know. Maybe some of that will come out more so in some of the presentations and additional data, but point taken. All right, any other questions?
The only other, and this would be if you're keeping it really small, the Education Commission of the states can be an advisor that can bring you information on what other states are doing in the space. And even if they're not personally advisors, they can produce reports for you, and I just want to recommend them to you.
Okay. Yeah, I have them in here somewhere.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
they were great in the last round about bringing what other states were doing, although the data was relatively limited because Virginia was further ahead than most states. But certainly now they could help us, you know, with the review of other state data, you know, provide us that analysis as well.
Okay.
I also wonder, Dr. Lane, maybe under Leah Walker or the committee that was on equity, is there someone or a group you would recommend on that, from that group, or who would you recommend from the equity lens perspective? Because I don't see that specifically here.
Yeah, good.
Well, certainly Leah is someone I would have as an advisor, but you know, she will be part of the agency staff. When I think about the work that the African American History Commission has been doing, IDRA has been a really great partner in this space, and they run the Equity Assistance Center of the South, and so that's one. And then their equity leads in other organizations as well. CCSSO has an equity team that we could bring, and so I think her name is Annie Holmes. But so yeah, I can make recommendations to you, and I would probably want to bring Leah in. But those are two I know that she thinks about all the time.
And then the only other one I would see is who might Maribel recommend from the EL perspective, because I do want us to look at that, and that would be an important, I'm not sure who she's been working with and partner on that, but that's important to me.
Yeah,
So
and I just got a message from Leah. She would recommend Education Trust. John King, the former Secretary of Ed under President Obama, leads that organization, and it's very equity focused, so they know policy. So I would recommend Education Trust. And then if beyond Leah, there are equity coordinators in several of our school divisions, so maybe a representative of that group as well.
Did you provide a name for the Education Trust, Velia?
Oh, I don't know that he will do it himself, but John King leads that group. But I think the organization might be an advisor to the board. But we can certainly ask Dr. King.
Yeah, we have worked with them in the past, not on this topic specifically, but we can certainly, Leah and I can work to potentially identify someone from Education Trust that could help support the committee's work.
And then again, Dr. Lane, if you heard my last comment on ELL, but anyone that you'd recommend with that, Dr. Lane, with Maribel, a group, an organization that's been working with you?
Yeah, I think if Leah's on the phone, she can make a recommendation. We have staff that I would recommend, but obviously staff will be at the table all throughout this process. But I'll have to defer to Leah on who might be best, because this is such a nuanced policy conversation. So let me circle back on that one. Or Leah, if you're on, feel free to jump in.
Okay. Well, we can circle back if we leave the EL as a blank and just making sure we get someone there.
Yeah, I'll get a name there for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so to move on to the next bullet, just referring back to the presentation we received yesterday from the department, and a lot of good information, a lot of good historical context. Were there any gaps in understanding or additional information that our committee would like to request of the board other than what's listed on the screen?
Could I make one comment about the second bullet there? I know that Dr. Lane, I think, mentioned two of these two indicators that are noted here, but the question that I was raising yesterday, if there are other, just clearly understanding or remembering even the laundry list, if you will, of indicators that we vetted through back in 17, so that we are reminded of the ground that we've already plowed. And certainly we know that these two specifically kind of made the last cut, or the, kind of the almost last cut. But just having an appreciation for the kinds of things that were considered at the time, I think would be really helpful. For me, it would be helpful. And so if it's not good for the group, I'm happy for staff to just remind me of what that was, or point me to the board minutes or committee minutes so that I can capture them. Emily, if that's possible. I'm sorry to ask you to dig, but
Yeah, we have lots of information that I'm happy to pull together and give to you all as either background or make a presentation at the next committee meeting. So we're happy to do that digging. I was here for some of it, but we have lots of information that's out there.
so another thing I noted yesterday, as we were going through the philosophy of accountability, there's a bullet there that talks about that our accountability system, or generally, we wanted to make sure that technical assistance and school improvement resources were flowing in the way necessary to support schools. And it would be, again, if it's somewhere that we've already seen it, just bring it back to the surface. But what have been those efforts, right? So if we're going to assess or evaluate whether or not there's been progress made, whether we intended it or not, understanding what resources the department has put into the accreditation or support for schools around accreditation, that would be helpful to know. And whether those are staff resources or fiscal resources, if there are federal dollars that we've been able to reorchestrate or reconstitute, any of that.
Okay, captured that. What resources DOE has put into support for schools around SOA. All right. Any other gaps or requested information? I'm going to give people time to go back through their notes if they are. Okay, we can always come back to that if something else comes up. I'm sure there'll be more that'll develop over time. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about logistics. We've talked a little bit about timeline, but I really want to kind of get a little bit more granular and talk about our meeting cadence and what we propose an initial timeline might be, recognizing that it could likely change. My initial approach to most things like this is, if it's going to be a 1 year endeavor, you spend the first 2 months, 3 months, maybe meeting every 2 weeks or so to really kind of get the momentum going, and then you kind of level off into a monthly cadence to round things out and wrap it up. I was reminded, appropriately reminded, by one of my committee members of the time frame we're working in right now relative to the summer and the phases and schools opening up and the demands that are going to be on many of the people that are on this call. So I absolutely want to be sensitive to that. And I also want to be sensitive to my own time constraints. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what we feel like would be a good meeting cadence, meeting how often, for how long at a time, in order for us to really feel like we're making some progress. This is a democracy.
Well, I think, I mean, I agree with you in the beginning, maybe more, potentially more. We'll have to see when we start. But at the very least, if there's a way we can tackle it on the way we did the other committees, where it was connected to our board meeting the day before or the afternoon, that way, in case other board members want to join with us. And I know we don't meet every month, but as a board, or maybe this would meet every month regardless. So on those 4 months we don't meet, I would say we would have one of these meetings. So at least initially, kind of balancing the need of what you said of reopening schools and everything. I would say monthly for now, but I'm open to, but literally monthly, on those 4 months that we wouldn't meet.
For how long at a time each month would you recommend?
What do we normally do, Emily? I think it was what, hour and a half, 2 hours? Is that what it was?
Yeah, so it obviously would depend on who the presenters or how many topics we wanted to tackle each meeting. But I would say a 2-hour time frame,
Yeah.
certainly prepare at least one presentation to come in, but then certainly time for committee members and anyone else that may be involved in the meeting to have time to discuss and keep the progress moving forward. And as Francisco said, we don't have an August meeting, but that may also be a good time for this group to meet, even though the board doesn't meet. I know that that's often a vacation time, but maybe not quite as much this year for folks. So we can, as long as I have, some heads up and we can kind of map out meetings in advance, that way I can line some folks up. We're happy to meet as often as you all feel we need to.
So yeah, I would say 2 hours. And then the other request I would say is that we really identify, help us, Emily, what are those dates and get those to us right away. So
Absolutely.
we can start to prioritize this in our calendar. So, but I think 2 hours is good once a month. And if we see the need at one of those meetings to add, additional time, then we would all agree. But for a foundation, I would say monthly for 2 hours is my recommendation.
Okay.
I would agree with that. And if we find that there's information, and I know we're all busy, but for me, sometimes if I have the information ahead of time, or some information that doesn't actually need a presentation, if it's, kind of reading materials, that may help expedite sort of some of the process or background gathering. But I agree, no more than 2 hours. I think we get to a point where we're not necessarily as productive as we might be, beyond that 2 hour, especially on Zoom. In person, you have the energy, right, of the people around you. But this maybe is a little more difficult. So that would be my suggestion.
Very good.
I agree with the 2 hours.
Okay. Monthly?
Yes, ma'am, monthly. And then step it up as we need to.
Okay. All right. Sounds like that's the general consensus of the team. So that is what we will go with. So that will be the plan.
Following this meeting, from a staff perspective, we can plan for the special committee to meet on a Wednesday before your Thursday, July meeting. And then we can work on some August dates. I can work with Dr. Paxton on some good dates that work for her and then get that out to the group here in the next week or so.
Okay. Sounds good.
And then
And
would we assume, Emily, then that for the September and our other dates moving forward, that it would also be the Wednesday afternoon?
I think it would be safe to assume that, that could be at least a held date. And then, Dr. Paxton and I can see if we need to meet more often and add some dates in, but we'll certainly, give folks as much advance notice and make sure that the dates work for others. slightly easier over Zoom in the fact that you don't have to travel to Richmond, but certainly the challenges of being on Zoom in general are there.
Well, and that's another reason why, once we eventually do travel to Richmond, if we have it on the times we're already coming down for this, that's why I'm recommending that. Because that will
Yeah,
be
absolutely.
helpful for
We
me,
can
and I'm
plan
sure
to
for
do that.
others. I'm looking at everyone on our committee. Maybe Dr. Wilson doesn't have to travel as far as the rest of us, but for Keisha and Pam
Not,
and I, we would
not as far, but it's still travel.
still travel, still travel. But think of Pam driving all those hours she does to get here. So as much as we can put that on when we're already there. would be
Yeah.
helpful.
And, we do have, the flexibility right now to meet virtually. I anticipate that flexibility will continue for a while, until kind of potentially we're even out of the pandemic. So there could even be a combination of in-person once we're able to meet in person and virtual if we need to do that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So I just identified, we'll guesstimate a year, could be a little less, could be a little more, could be a lot more. Meeting monthly for 2 hours, starting now and beginning in July. All right. I was going to get a little bit down into a little bit more detail about breaking that up. Typically in our team, we try to set some goals around some phases within that year, but we won't go to that level of detail now. What I'd like to spend just maybe about, up maybe go to about 2:10 and then open the floor for any final discussions and thoughts, but spend the next 8 minutes or so just really just taking another look at the outline. I said that we could use the balance of the time to start filling in some of these categories. But I first want to ask, I know I asked if everybody was good with this approach. I do want to validate, is there anything that's not asked or captioned in this framework that we want to make sure we do? We're looking at facts, assumptions, risks, all that. Is there any other category of thought or category of awareness that we want to have? Just want to be open to that. Okay. Another question I have is relative to the working committee. Myself, I prefer to kind of like Dr. Wilson mentioned, I prefer to get content in advance, read it and absorb it, and then be able to contribute. But I also prefer to contribute in the present with the team, rather than me putting my thoughts, like putting this document in Google Drive or whatever, and everybody dumping into it. And then we get back to the meeting and everybody's got to unpack their thoughts. So some people prefer to do that because they don't want to take the time to watch it happen on, occur. But I do want to, some feedback from the team. You're welcome to go and put some thought into where you think you might put some of your ideas and thoughts from yesterday. But I would recommend that we actually do the staff work in these meetings and we do some of that research and reading outside. I got a thumbs up from Dr. Duran, so we're going with it.
No, that's just me. There's two others.
Yeah, I agree.
Your thumb went up pretty quick though.
It
You're
did,
like, yeah,
but
do the staff work here.
because I really was in sync with that. I really like that approach, and
I think you can more have the dialogue that way.
I really appreciate that too.
For sure. Okay, so I'm gonna really just kind of open the floor up for any final thoughts about, this whole endeavor. Maybe use some of this time if there were some lingering thoughts you had from yesterday's presentation, that you'd want to share with the board for consideration. This is relative to the DOE and to the committee. Just a chance to digress before we wrap up.
Dr. Paxton, I know you added it because I put it in the chat, but for the VSBA and VAS members out there, we listed that as possible advisors, and I just wanted to note that you added that. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, thank you for sending it.
So Dr. Paxton, go ahead.
No, sorry, that's it. I'm good.
Sorry, I've been doing that to you all day, James. I'm sorry. So before we get off the call, is there do we have a thought about kind of what will happen in our next meeting? So, because that's, like I said, next week, that's July. And kind of in terms of the cadence that you're seeking to set,
Yes.
and what we believe will be our kicking off or next steps, I guess.
Yeah, I would anticipate that at least all of next meeting, if not all of next meeting and even spilling over into the next, and maybe that'll go hand in hand with the presentation in the August meeting. But I feel like all of next meeting is really going to be the staff work to really start to begin to fill in these categories. We're really going to talk about what are those facts, assumptions, considerations, and things that we want to make sure that we're aligned in. And so that's what the next meeting in my mind is going to be about. That tends to take a little bit longer than I think it's going to. So I'm giving it some more cushion. And my intent would be is wrapping up that meeting, getting a good understanding of what presentation or presentations we might want from a data standpoint from the board. From the department in the August meeting. During those conversations, the way I kind of see this playing out in my mind is, let's first get grounded in what we're doing. Let's find out what additional information we need to have, presentations, data, research. Based on that, who else do we want to hear from? That's when I feel like we get into the special advisors and things like that. And then after that, I feel like we're in the so what stage. What are we going to do with all that? So that's kind of how I saw this playing out.
Great. Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Just wanted to make sure I understood.
Dr. Pexton, could you expand a little bit more on kind of specifics of a staff presentation? Because as Dr. Wilson mentioned, we're almost at July, and I just want to make sure that from a staff perspective, we're starting to pull those items together for you all, and can also get them to you in advance for you to have some time to review.
Yeah. I don't anticipate a staff presentation in July. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. I anticipate using July for this committee to be doing staff work on this document.
Gotcha.
And I'm hoping that we will wrap up that meeting with a little bit more context to, well, so who do we want to hear from in August? That staff work though may spill over into August. I'll have to see kind of how July goes, but I don't anticipate wanting a presentation unless the committee already knows up front who we want to hear from first. I'd like to level set us in this document first.
One suggestion, if it's possible, if we can identify, or Emily and Dr. Lane helping us, the committee advisors and actually who those are, to at least invite them to July to listen and, to the conversation that you just talked about, Dr. Pexton, because I do think I've been a committee advisor in another format, and being able to hear the understanding and the thinking helped influence my ability to really be effective in providing some thought to the process overall. So if at all possible, and maybe we won't have them all identified, but as many as we can identify, and then Emily, you send an invite just, for them to watch. It wouldn't be presenting of anything like that, but I think it would be meaningful for them to listen.
You're spot on, Dr. Duran, and I'll be honest with you, that's part of one of the residual values of this type of document. You can really organize the team's thought in a very clean way, and a team member that joins late or whatever can read this 2-page, 3-page document and really be grounded in what we're trying to accomplish. So yes, I do agree that there is value in kind of hearing and being a part of that dialogue, but that's also part of the intent of this. Is not only is it the intent of this to make sure we can bring people up to speed and people understand what our purpose is, but it's also to every once in a while when we need to be realigned with what we said 6 months ago. It kind of helps bring us back home. So, but I'm more than open to any of the committee advisors that we have listed here that either the committee or the department sees value in inviting them to the July meeting. Absolutely. So they can get that early context.
Thank you. And I appreciate, again, the long-term ability to have this document in our thinking to ground us, because I know that once we get into this or others start to contribute, it could try and pull us different ways. So I appreciate that. And I was only responding to Emily when she asked about what the staff work might be between now and then. And I was requesting that if there might be staff assistance in helping to firm up these names and then invite them.
Absolutely. We're, Dr. Lane and I can work with Dr. Pexton. Maybe we want to have some kind of more overarching advisors that could advise on the whole holistic part, whereas some others may be more strategic in different areas, but we can certainly start to identify them and make sure that they're at least aware and included in that first initial July meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be helpful for me too, working with you and Dr. Lean.
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Other concluding thoughts, questions?
Just to say, we have the right committee chair who's
Absolutely.
going to steer us through this. And
We've
thank
got
you
our
for
first meeting
helping
down.
us organize.
You might even make me want to become an engineer. No, not really.
No, you don't want to do
I
that.
won't go that far, Dr. Wilson, but I
That's
will appreciate it.
I'm not even an engineer. I just have hung out with them for 20 years, and so they've rubbed off on me. So,
But seriously, thank you. I really appreciate you helped us. I was worried coming into it today was going to be with this committee. And after just the first few minutes, I felt at ease and really now feel comfortable for us to put ourselves together and put some good work. So that was a lot of preparation you did. And I don't just say that lightly. I just want to say thank you.
thank you. Appreciate that.
I'd like to say thank you for being very understanding too, that we're getting ready to go into our heaviest phase of the year to start schools back. So thank you.
Absolutely. Sure. Great.
Thanks. Thank you, Keisha.
Okay. No problem. All right. So this will wrap up the first meeting of the special committee to review the accreditation standards, and we will resume in July. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See ya.
Take care.